Okay, so this is going to be our lecture on attempts to control and manage anxiety. So as opposed to what is anxiety and stress, we're going to look at people's various attempts to control it, a lot of which gets referred to as relaxation techniques, but we're going to just look at the whole span ranging from physical interventions, cognitive interventions, and hopefully just show you that there's an awful lot of options out there. And the message will be that every time you're thinking of making a recommendation, you'll need to actually match the exact intervention you're planning to the person required and actually check the evidence supports that intervention for that person and that aim, because they can vary. So if we go through, it's going to be a whistle-stop tour of all the suggested techniques, of which there are very many, and there'll be a few slides in the middle where it looks like we're just naming them and moving on, because individual techniques haven't always been tested individually. So each time you're thinking of recommending a technique, or each time you're investigating a particular technique, try and find either tests of that exact technique or tests of techniques just like it, and if possible, if it's out there, find attempts to test that technique on the exact goals and the exact person or people, type of person you're trying to do the intervention with. A good rule of thumb when trying to plan interventions to reduce or manage anxiety is the matching hypothesis, whereby if the anxiety being experienced is cognitive, you would seek to implement a cognitive intervention and change the way someone thinks. And if the anxiety being experienced is somatic and physical, then you would try and manage it in a physical way with breathing or muscular relaxation. The problem occurs because it's difficult to know which comes first sometimes, and so it might be that someone feels anxious in their body, and that leads them to interpret those signals as negative, and so you could say, well, it started in the body, let's manage that. But equally, it can work the other way, where someone sometimes feels that their thought pattern is what leads them to become anxious, and then their body kicks off and all the fight or flight responses happen, and before you know it, they're in full anxiety response as a result of their thoughts. So it's difficult to know which comes first sometimes, and you often end up having to either make a judgment call, or sometimes people would recommend a bit of both. But if there's more of one or the other, or if one seems to come first, that will lead us to a matching hypothesis. Ultimately, what we want is for our athlete or performer to become self-aware of what makes them anxious. So is it going to be certain situations, certain events, certain people or locations, and what happens during those moments? What do you think about? What do you feel? What are the early warning signs, so that the athlete becomes empowered to actually make the changes and hopefully act early rather than trying to firefight once they've become anxious, nipping it in the bud and catching it early. So what thoughts go through your head, what signs do you get from your body, and then usually you would ask, what do you currently do about it, and what could we give you to do that would actually help. So it changes by people. Some people become nervous a long way in advance in anticipation of the situation. Sometimes it's the night before. There's a little bit of evidence using the CSAI2 questionnaire, which showed that there was a spike in anxiety just before competition. In particular, cognitive would rise quite slowly, but the somatic would kick in right before the event started. It could be that it's on the way to the ground, the dressing room, as you cross onto the oval or the pitch or the track or the pool. It might even be that you're fine until the game starts, and then all of a sudden it all kicks in. It might be that everything's fine until you receive some criticism or make a mistake. Any of those are fine, and it's just a matter of then saying, within each of those situations, what's possible. If you're controlled and away from the competitive event, then you probably have more capacity and more things you can do. If it's in the middle of the event or the competition that you become anxious, then you're limited in how many ways you can actually respond. You couldn't go and sit down and do imagery, for example, or relax and spend a few minutes going through every muscle in your body, because the game would carry on. we'll see that a lot of the trouble people have can come from just unhelpful and inappropriate thoughts, and so sometimes we need to manage those and have answers for them, try and prevent them from happening in the first place, which is quite difficult, and trying to keep the athlete thinking about what is useful and what is helpful in that moment. There's usually a time and a place for self-doubt and thinking about things and analysing things, but it's very rarely anywhere near the actual competition, because that's unhelpful and it's thinking about things that won't help you achieve your goals. When it comes to the other side, what the negative thoughts can happen, but the negative or the unpleasant experiences and physical changes, a fairly familiar list hopefully: butterflies in the stomach, increases in heart rate, sleepless nights, wanting to go to the toilet, feeling tense in your arms and shoulders and back maybe, sometimes feeling shaky. So these are all quite common, and there's a logic behind it, because that is, those things allow you to fight or flight more, so that restricting blood flow to the extremities and the mouth for that matter means that you aren't going to produce saliva and you'll get a dry mouth. But of course it does mean all the blood is going to the muscles and the heart and lungs, which is where you need it to go so that you can run or fight. Likewise, the need to go to the toilet, you need to be as light as possible if that's going to happen. So there's a logic behind it. However, more often than not, in the current context of it's just sport, it's just a performance, a lot of these reactions become unhelpful, and we need to manage them and either use them to our advantage or minimise the harm that's occurring. So we're going to just spend some time now going through the somatic or physiological interventions, which are also thought of as muscle to mind, working upwards from the body, and if you calm the body, perhaps the mind will follow. It's obviously a false distinction to draw a line somewhere between mind and body. I've mentioned this elsewhere, but because they are deeply connected and interwoven, and if you had to draw a line somewhere on a picture of where the brain ends and the body begins, it's quite difficult as we go through the base of the brain and into the spinal column to know at what point is central command no longer involved. And even at the very base of our spine, towards the end of the base of the spine, we're finding some very sophisticated reflexes. So it's not an ideal distinction, but it helps us to heuristically think about whether we're working upwards from the body or actually controlling downwards from the mind. The trick with relaxation training, somatic techniques generally, is that we'll try and teach something over the course of time that it takes a while to learn, and in its initial phases takes some time to do, but then you try and reach the point where the athlete can do it very quickly, so that by becoming familiar with how the outcome of this relaxation feels, and also with how to perform it and perhaps automating and grooving the way you do it, then you become quite proficient at being able to take your arousal and anxiety levels down a couple of notches. So that's the trick, and often sometimes people will say, well, just breathe or just relax, and it sounds very easy, but there is definitely work that needs doing, where you teach the technique, the outcome and the process become very familiar to the athlete so that they can, and it's deeply personal how those sensations will feel. So it's very important that they learn that, and then you can implement it in competition quickly, hopefully. So it's something that you might consider for out-of-season training, whereby you get the hang of it first and then build it into your pre-season and make it something you can do during the competition. So if we go through these, there's a few variable options available. A classic technique is simply controlling breathing. Very often when we're anxious, we find that our breathing becomes quick and short and shallow. So usually we want people to practice deeper breathing and controlling their breathing, and we often focus on what's called diaphragmatic breathing, whereby rather than simply using the intercostal muscles to raise the ribcage, we actually use the big diaphragm here, which sucks in more air. And it's obviously beneficial, you'd hope, to get more oxygen into the body, and therefore you're able to get out to the muscles quicker and perform better. But there's different approaches to it, and some are focusing on control, some are focusing on the ratio, and we just need to be aware of those. There'll be very few studies out there on each particular type, but knowing the differences is useful for when you come to interpret those studies and perhaps think about whether you recommend them to athletes, for example. So first of all, we focus on the complete breath using the diaphragm like I mentioned, and that's a good place to start. Obviously, the idea is that you are able to take control, overcome that sort of instinct to breathe quickly and shallow, which it's hard to know where it's come from, whether it be because it's something we do when we're hiding and we just don't want to make any noise, but it's something which is quite a common response, and often if a filmmaker is trying to make the viewers of their film feel nervous, they'll play the sound of the person's breathing as they're chased by the baddie, and it will usually be short, sharp breaths rather than deep, flowing breaths that actually get oxygen into the body. So you can become aware of that, you can gain control of it, analogous to proprioception really, or any skill where you learn how to operate that aspect of the body. So another version of it would be to inhale slowly and in a controlled way, and then hold that breath for a few seconds, and then as you exhale you really sigh and you try and relax your whole shoulders and rib cage at the same time, so that it triggers that kind of relaxing response. And there are physiological effects that happen. We know that as you breathe in, the pressure in your rib cage changes, and there are baroreceptors, and the same when you breathe out, it changes the other way, and that can affect your heart rate. So we know that we're playing on real physiological responses here, and it's just then trying to deliberately use them to our advantage. So another attempt would be simply rhythmic breathing, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. And these are just different versions of the same basic thing of controlling your breathing. It could be that there's a 1-to-2 ratio, in for 4, out for 8, so slowing things down, and the ratio might change depending whether it be 4 to 8, 5 to 10, but generally it's twice as long to breathe out as in. Anecdotally, people will say it's very powerful, but obviously before we recommend it to our athletes and coaches, we need to check the evidence and be sure as to why we think it's working. So does the evidence support it, and does the theory explain why this would happen, and then we've got enough to work with usually. Another version of the breathing intervention is called centering, and it's the idea where you would actually, as well as breathing, try and find your proverbial center. So it's obviously been taken from meditation and those kind of concepts. And if we just take a classic version of it, you'd say, okay, well then you stand and you create a stable base and you focus on your having a low center of gravity, and that can be your center. And you breathe from the stomach using the diaphragm. Again, you could think about things like inhaling confidence, in with the good, out with the bad, as they say sometimes. Just combining, building on the breathing and actually thinking of useful thoughts and relaxing thoughts. So you can play with that as well, and it can become a kind of script that you might construct for your athlete. But the idea is that it's more than just breathing. We're starting to build layers on this first technique. So we take breathing as the base and then build on that. And there are also other ways around doing it, but what you often find is relaxation interventions become multifaceted, and there's various things going on. We can divide them up into breathing, and even subdivide that into types of breathing. And you can also, in a second, look at the muscular relaxation, and this is kind of centering would sit in between the two, I imagine, as being a good overlap. And it just demonstrates that you can throw in various ideas, even at the somatic, physiological level, and end up trying to create something very personalised, but that we think will definitely work for that athlete. So progressive muscular relaxation, very popular, also just abbreviated to PMR, first suggested by Jacobson, but the idea is that you work around the whole body and actually relax different muscle groups at a time and end up being as relaxed as you physically can be, in your muscles at least. So you normally find that this comes with a script, and the script would normally contain the idea of both tensing the muscles first and then relaxing them and shaking out any remaining tension in those muscles. It can take a while to get the hang of it, and the idea is that you become familiar with the technique as you tense and then relax. And a classic technique would be to work from the toes right through the foot, the calf and the thighs, all the way up, and then go through your arms and go through your stomach and back, even do your face and clench your face and then relax it. So you end up having clenched and relaxed every single muscle, and then hopefully feeling very relaxed. And generally speaking, if we do this in a classroom full of people, people will report that they feel better afterwards. So it's out there. It gets reasonable support in the evidence, and I'd recommend that you have a look at that before recommending it. The difficulty is that it takes some time. As mentioned, you then want to get the athlete able to do it quickly and perhaps be able to perform quick scans for tension and simply correct the bits that are tense and leave the rest alone. Another thing you can do is, I think it's the next one, to just focus on the relaxation phase and skip out the tensing phase. So another technique would be to just focus on the relaxation phase and skip out the contraction phase, the tensing phase. And there are different ways of speeding up. You could tense all at once and then gradually relax the whole body, for example, piece by piece. But the end point is that the athlete knows how it feels to be relaxed and is able to do that of their own volition and under their own control without needing to be guided through it. So it becomes a physical skill. And as I said, you can sometimes just skip out the tensing phase and just try and relax in one direction, not need to tense first. So that's called passive progressive muscular relaxation. But again, different subtypes of the same core technique. Given that most people are believed to carry tension in their neck and shoulders, then we could just focus on those parts. Although you could just ask the athlete, and as they become aware, they might find that they carry tension in different places. But one classic technique is just to focus on the neck and shoulders and try and relax those. And then you might find that that's enough and you haven't got to do the whole body. So we know that these things take a long time the first time round, and as you learn, it's just then finding ways of speeding up and making it practical to be done in the heat of performance and competition. So if we move on now to the thinking approaches, so this would be classified as mind to muscle, or if we're focusing on the type of anxiety, it's cognitive anxiety. So these are cognitive interventions matched to that type of anxiety. There's a lot of different approaches, varying from meditation, visualization, retraining people's thought patterns. There's a school of thought around autogenic training, which was kind of based on self-hypnosis to an extent. So we're going to just go through all of these again, and I want you to be aware of the different types that are available, and also aware that what often happens is that they're just all mixed into one big pot and thrown at athletes as an intervention, and that the bits that stick, the bits that work are great, but that often just misses out the fact that there are different things will work for different people. So we can say our intervention works because we threw everything at them and some of it stuck, but that loses a level of understanding and sensitivity to what actually is working and why. So that's to be aware of, but the things that we do include classic meditation, where you actually, of course, you can focus on the physical side of this, but there's another side to meditation whereby you actually try and relax and quiet the mind. And it's been so different ways. Obviously, it's closely associated to some different religions, but it can be done in a irreligious way, independent of that. And the basic idea is that you stop trying to control your thoughts and allow them to simply slip away, ending up, hopefully, with what's called a quiet mind. And And you can sometimes detect this in people's eye movements. They tend to make fewer fixations in those circumstances, and you can detect it in brainwaves. People will often move towards what's called just the alpha pattern, where there are only really alpha brainwaves and all the other types tend to have gone quiet. And that would be an indication that you're actually mentally very relaxed and not trying to effortfully process and control your thinking. So the basic approach, if we take what Herbert Benson originally recommended, would be to find somewhere quiet, adopt a comfortable position, have some kind of core mental device, like a particular thought you want to return to or a mantra, and then be passive about other thoughts as they come and go, and don't attempt to force them out and don't attempt to grab them and analyse them, just let them pass through. So again, the whole point with this one would be to become familiar with that and good at it so that you can do it very quickly, and that's going to take some time to learn. Regarding imagery, it can be used for many things. We've mentioned skill learning, motivation, confidence. One of the things it can be used for is actually controlling arousal and anxiety. And often there's two approaches. You can either have a happy place approach where you have an image in mind that is particularly relaxing, so a beach somewhere or a honeymoon, whatever it might be. And that's, some people think that's good. I remember reading about Johnny Wilkinson, the rugby player, when he was standing over a kick to try and calm himself down. Allegedly had an image of waking up on a Sunday morning with the sun just peeping through the curtains to the sound of his wife or girlfriend kind of just, I think it was just hoovering the house as I recall, or vacuuming. And everything was kind of perfect, and that was his relaxing thought before he then went into the kick. It's a nice idea, and we've certainly heard of things like that. So there's the kind of the happy place approach, and there's also the idea of using imagery deliberately to manage your physical state. And one of those I've heard of as an example is called the tension drainer, where you imagine any tension in your body as being a liquid that's kind of hot and bubbling and unpleasant, and you imagine that you've got taps on the ends of your fingers and toes, and you're able to open up those taps and drain that tension and that liquid out of your body, and it's replaced by something calm and a different colour, let's say green or blue, and it's soothing and it's not bubbling and it's, you know, cool, for example. So you imagine the tension draining out and being replaced by this soothing liquid, and that, if done, you know, properly, it can take a few minutes to get the hang of it. But again, the idea is you're able to do it very quickly when it matters, and that's another way I've seen of using imagery to manage people's arousal states. So there's our classic example of a happy place imagery. Each person will have their own, and the idea is you would try and spend some time developing that person's personal preference. It might be very different. I remember Sally Pearson recently saying that her most quiet, relaxing moment was actually in the stadium competing, because all the hard work and things were finally out of the way and it was just time to do it. So, you know, not necessarily a relaxing image, but it might mean that that's something, a different definition of what it is to be calm and relaxed and quiet at last. The autogenic training idea is that we try and create this feeling of contentment and safety, and you often focus on physical sensations of warmth and heavy limbs and sort of relaxing rather than having to feel tense. And you'll hear people trying to do hypnosis talking about your limbs feel heavy and you can't lift them up and things, and it's just putting that suggestion out there so that the person begins to relax and not try to control their body. And we often find that that's part of the script for hypnosis, and therefore part of the script for doing it to yourself and becoming aware of what tricks and what thoughts actually will relax you. So it's very deliberate and very intentional, and therefore we're classifying it as a cognitive intervention. But as mentioned, we're focusing a lot on physical sensations and the perception of them. And so that is an illustration of the thin dividing line between mental and physical to an extent. So that this, because it comes with scripts, you often find these stages. So focusing on feelings of heaviness in the limbs and wanting to sink down and relax, and then feeling generally warm and content, and then focus on your heartbeat, and that slows down, and your breathing, and that becomes controlled and slower, and this warmth focuses down into your solar plexus, whereas your head is cool and calm. And so that would be a classic progression of the technique. And generally speaking, you would work towards having a particular script for the athlete that they're able to follow and perhaps memorise so that they can do it quickly when they need to. Probably the feeling we're creating here is quite different to the feeling most people will want to have when they're competing. So it becomes something whereby we want to be able to do it to a graded extent. So rather than going for full-on totally relaxed, which might be inappropriate, perhaps we create an awareness of the different levels and try and say, right, I want to feel this way when I'm about to kick, for example, or this way when I'm standing over an important putt. And how do I get to that, and how can I reliably create that feeling? And that becomes the key. So, yeah, you can add in, again, like we can layer up these interventions, you could add in visualization after the person's done this. I think it's always very important, like I said, to bear in mind how the person wants to feel when they compete and to try and prepare that, as opposed to just saying, let's just get you used to being completely relaxed, because that almost never happens in any competitive environment. A fairly new variation would be biofeedback, based on the idea of autogenic training, where you actually are trying to control your heartbeat and your breathing. It is possible to control those things. We just assume that they're out of our control most of the time. However, if you offer someone feedback of their breathing rate, heart rate, brain waves, galvanic skin resistance, that you're sweating, you can actually begin to control those things. And so when someone, for example, trains to beat a lie detector test, all they're doing is using biofeedback to teach themselves how to hide certain signs and symptoms from the machine. That's a good example, really, of the use of biofeedback, and it's becoming increasingly popular. And even there are games now, for example, where there's a ball on the table, and if you can produce more alpha brainwaves, then the ball moves towards the goal of your opponent. And so it's kind of something which we're getting better at using. There's some initial research suggesting that these things can be trained, and therefore that's useful for athletes who need to become familiar with how these things feel. So it's an option, and we could, if we had the money, we could think about using it with each athlete, or failing that, at least maybe short-term training and bringing someone in to train them, and then sending them away to reflect on how they managed to achieve these changes, if they managed it. But the whole point, as always, really is empowering the athlete to be able to control things when they need to. It's been used already in clinical settings, so for chronic anxiety or anxiety illnesses. Again, the idea is that you're shown your performance on some sort of live graph or a computer screen, and you're actually encouraged to try and control it, which might be completely trial and error to begin with, but then you gradually learn that if I change my breathing, then my heart rate changes, or if I think this thought, then my brainwaves change, for whatever it might be. So you gradually learn what's working and what's not, and it's that closer integration of the mind and body again. The fact that they're all part of the same machine, they exist very close together actually. So the chances are you should be able to control them. It's just that we often assume that it's because we can't immediately do it. It's not easy. Maybe it's not possible. So even back in '88, we were seeing that this has promise. And you can even buy vests now that monitor most of the things we're trying to look for, and the person can train with the vest on, and then you could even give them the feedback live as they're on the bike or playing the game as to what their physical state is and whether they'd like to try and control it and change it. Cognitive techniques, classic cognitive techniques stolen from different, again, usually clinical or psychodynamic schools of thought. we would look to change the way that someone actually appraises the situation, remembering that the definition of stress is when the perceived demands of the situation outweigh the person's perceived ability to cope. It's all perceived, it's all cognitive, and even then they have to perceive that there's an important consequence of failing. So there's a lot of perceiving and thought going on there. So it could be that we change people's interpretation of the demands of the situation, of their coping resources, or of the consequences of failing or succeeding, and that can be very useful. So we would say, okay, and generally we find things like rephrasing or focusing on restructuring, for example, and they're the sort of phrases that you'll hear, and they're the things you should search for if you want to investigate this technique. So restructuring wise, we're actually trying to retrain the way that someone interprets things, and so it's structuring is obviously quite integral. So you're talking about sort of a big change in the way someone thinks and interprets events. Really drawn from what was called rational emotive therapy, rational emotive technique. And we can do it with athletes like we can do it in clinical settings. The difference is that with clinical situations, it's causing severe problems to the point where people's day-to-day lives are being affected. Whereas if we do it with athletes, it's not so much that they can't go and live, it's just that it's preventing them from performing their best. So there might be some differences in the way that we apply the technique relative to the clinical groups. However, what you often see is that people have this irrational or not really thought through need for perfection or need to get things right and get things perfect, and sometimes it's quite unreasonable. And we're saying, well, why do you have this technique, this thought and this core belief, and can it be restructured, and is failure that bad, and is it okay is failure part of eventually succeeding, for example? So we need to change the way someone thinks about it, and that's hard, it takes time. Someone can suggest that you think about it differently, and it doesn't always stick, so you might have to add a layer of not only here are some thoughts, but can you keep a track of how your current thoughts are influencing you and affecting you, and that's difficult and it takes time. It might take a diary, and that's hassle for the athlete. So it becomes not just have a thought, I'm sure that'll fix it, but what are your current thoughts doing? When you're able to have these other thoughts, do they help? And then hopefully building in this kind of ability to detect what's working and what's not working, and the idea is therefore that these would prove themselves to be helpful and useful. We often find that irrationally, again, people, because they're very ingrained, people will cling to the irrational beliefs about being unable to cope or about needing to be perfect first time every time. And so we need to almost demonstrate that the irrational beliefs are leading to this distorted thinking whereby failure is intolerable, and if I fail, I'm a bad person, and somehow challenge those beliefs and show that if we can change those thoughts and beliefs and perhaps substitute them in or associate different thought patterns with each situation, then hopefully the actual experience and the behaviour will change as well. Very difficult to do in one session, and I think when people expect a quick fix in psychology, this is where they go wrong. This kind of intervention would take some time, in the same way that the relaxation techniques earlier would take time to learn and then to get good at, and then you're able to deploy them. This too is it's a whole new way of thinking, and that's often quite difficult to simply to do. Even though our brain is infinitely flexible and changeable in many ways, it's actually very hard to do it immediately. Which leads to, well, why can these techniques fail if they're so many and the thought behind them makes so much sense? Well, initially it might be as simple as that the person doesn't trust you and what you're recommending. And if we're talking about changing the way someone thinks about the world, that's a big thing to want to change. And if it was a drug that did that, you'd want to give consent before you took the drug. And sometimes we throw around ideas and recommendations without pausing to think, does the person want to make this change? Because it's a big change, and it probably affects more than just their sporting performance. Realistically, it might affect their whole life. So we want to have rapport and trust, and we want the person to deliberately choose, I'm going to do this thing, I think it's going to help me. We also know that insufficient practice is an issue, whereby people try and use the technique before they've learned to do it properly. And like I mentioned, actually becoming self-aware and self-monitoring what's working is very important. And if someone isn't doing that, if they just use the technique randomly or as part of a routine when it isn't needed, then we're not really achieving our aims with it. It can also be that there's a pattern where people don't like to be out of control, so when they relinquish control as part of meditation or as part of a deep breathing exercise, people don't like to let go of that control, and that can undermine some of the techniques that we've reviewed here. You also get people who say, well, I can relax, but just not when the pressure's on, and that's understandable. And then we need to, like I've said, build the skill away from the pressure, but find ways of incorporating it, perhaps through training and putting it into the training environment in the pre-season, so that eventually it becomes something which can be done under pressure. We wouldn't expect it to be something you can do under pressure straight away. And again, managing the expectations of your athletes and coaches is probably important to make sure that it doesn't get thrown out because it doesn't work when it wouldn't be expected to work yet. Another thing you see is people, this idea of ironic processing, where by trying to relax you can sometimes make yourself worse, and it's the classic thing where you try and make yourself go to sleep and then you end up wide awake. So again, managing expectations about what's possible, letting people know that it's okay to have these ironic and contradictory thoughts and to manage them appropriately, rather than going, I can't do this, it's not within my skill set. We need to let people know that it's okay to struggle, but to keep pursuing the end goal. If we're to work with athletes, most of the techniques that we've discussed will involve some sort of script or some sort of structure, and it's worth developing those. You could have a base that you kind of personalise to each athlete, because another key theme is that you end up personalising them more often than not. If you are going to do these kind of things with athletes live, you can practice the pacing and the fluency of the speech, and I've certainly found that helps in group sessions to actually have a particular memorised pattern that I go through and try and change the way that I speak so that it becomes a little bit more soothing and more kind of slow and clear. It's worth devoting time to it in the same way that we would, a personal trainer, for example, would actually devote a whole session just to building on fitness. We can develop it. We can devote whole sessions to working on these skills, and that's okay. We shouldn't be afraid to do that. We need to offer structure and support to the clients, whether it be through sending them documents to fill in or sending them recordings of a script, whatever it might be. We do need to support this. We can't easily just say, well, work it out for yourself. Yes, they need to detect their own personal symptoms and signs and know how it feels, but we can assist in that process. And really, we should monitor adherence. If the person comes back and says it hasn't worked, but they never did the practice, then that would explain the problem straight away. As with many of these talks about interventions, we can refer back to large reviews of the different approaches, and Zellamore's PhD was on this. It's still a good source to use, and then it was updated for the book she wrote with Frank Gardner in 2006. Taking some of the better quality papers that are out there, Zella found 11, but I've taken a couple here. The pattern generally is that there are very few done with athletes, and especially elite athletes. That's quite rare. Remember that randomised control trials are our gold standard if we want to say with certainty that something works, and it wasn't caused by maturation and people getting better generally. It wasn't caused by people just returning to their previous standard because they were currently having a wobble, and that's called regression to the mean. We need to be sure that the thing that we did cause the difference relative to some other people who didn't get that help, that needs randomised controlled trials, or else we have to change the claims that we make. So that we can see that there are actually some randomised controlled trials done, which is great. Only 3 in the athletes, and only, the level probably isn't ideal. But as always, we see a lot of studies with undergraduates because they're easy to get hold of. You can just walk into your lecture and say, I'm recruiting you guys, or you can even make it something they have to do for course credit. It's important, as always, to offer a manual of what was done so that other people can see what you did and whether it was kitchen sink, everything, or whether it was quite refined and specific. So if studies don't include the manual, that's a problem, and there are a couple here that didn't. And when we review the results, we can see, okay, top of the list, relaxation performed better than control, good. Second, visual, motor, breathing and relaxation was better than just imagery, but that was the same as bodily relaxation. So basically the kitchen sink approach worked better than the relaxation or imagery alone. Only on one of 3 measures though. In the Risberg and Anschel study, the combination was better than individual approaches, but they were about the same as control. So when you work down that list, it's actually quite equivocal. It's very hard to say managing arousal definitely works, and it's very hard to say which particular type of managing arousal or anxiety is better than the others. The only result we get with any kind of consistency is that the kitchen sink approach of just do everything and hope something sticks. That's the only one that seems to generally develop some results. And even then it depends what you measure. So most of these questions were about impacting on performance, but it might be that we're not worried about that. We're worried about an enjoyable experience. We're worried about lasting a whole match because the anxiety is physically tiring you out. So these are just asking, did it make the athlete perform better? And that is a difficult thing to test and to prove. There's been a recent trend I want to add at the end to focusing on resilience and positive psychology. So I mentioned earlier the idea of the coping resources. Does a person perceive that they're able to cope with anything? And very often we're quite pessimistic about what we can cope with until bad things happen, when it turns out that we actually get on with life and kind of just muddle through. So actually people are remarkable copers, and it usually takes something really bad to happen for us to realise that we can just carry on and life will change, but we'll still be here afterwards. So what you get is, when you focus on resilience, you find that there's a class of people who are not affected by what other people are stressed out by, and they just seem to carry on and they're not worried. So whether it be called hardiness or mental toughness or resilience, there's something important there whereby some people just don't seem to either see a problem or they perceive that they can cope fine. And then drawing from positive psychology, we see there are people who have quite a lot of faith in their skill set, and they say, well, I can cope, no problem. I'll still be here afterwards, and we'll just get on with things. So there's a whole school of thought that says, well, maybe the best thing to do is to not become anxious or aroused in the first place, and that would be a whole different attitude. But I remember an interview with John McEnroe who said, when I get anxious, I never saw it as nerves or anxious. Like, it's the same for the other guy, and I would see it as a good sign that I'm ready to compete, and it was never a negative thing for me. So another key element here is the interpretation of the symptoms, and if you're feeling those physical signs, then you, rather than saying, oh, that's bad, I'm nervous, you say, good, I'm ready. Now, that's a crewing literature of important ideas there. But it's difficult because, rather than saying there's a problem and I can treat it with this, we're preventing a problem from ever happening, and that becomes more difficult to measure. However, if you want to go and look into this, Lou Hardy and his crew in Wales, David Fletcher and Mustafa Sarkar, and also Gucciardi, these are some names where you start to see this research being done. Fletcher and Sarkar in particular, focusing on resilience, have done some good papers recently. And you also find that we do start to overlap back into mental toughness, which is a different lecture in our series, but the ideas from that feed into the same thing here, whereby people just are considered mentally tough because they aren't affected by stressful situations in the first place. So if I was to try and summarise, there's many different techniques and approaches to trying to manage anxiety, but trying to reduce anxiety once it's happened is often too late, and it's better to avoid it happening in the first place. Where we do have these relaxation or management techniques, the results of the research are quite mixed, and that's kind of discouraging on the one hand, but then you have to realise that maybe we need to be personalising things more to the athlete and the sport and the situation. And of course, there's this whole new idea that perhaps we should prevent people from ever getting stressed because they're resilient and focusing on their positive coping skills. So if we do that, it might be that we inoculate people against stress and they never become stressed in the first place. And that's important. And that does lead us to that convergence with mental toughness research, which is, to be expected. There's no clear dividing line, and we have to define things ourselves before we go and start studying them. So I hope that's been an informative lecture. I think it's fair and realistic to say, you should have to go and dig a bit deeper from here, but at least now you're sensitised to the different approaches and ways of managing this and the different terminology that gets used, and so that you're ready to go and start exploring. And by all means, get in touch. Let me know if you're having particular problems with your assignment or your particular question. But that's it. They're the different techniques that we try and use to manage anxiety and arousal. For now, see you soon.